The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. Bad leadership and threats to democracy. That's what we'll be talking about on the show, and that's what you could be talking about Monday night at VIU's Malaspina Theatre. Michael MacKenzie, Vancouver Island University's Jarislowsky Chair in Trust and Political Leadership, will be giving a lecture called Bad Leaders, Bad Followers, Threats to Democracy That We Don't Talk Enough About. It'll be followed by a panel discussion and question and answer where MacKenzie will be joined by Angus Reid Institute President Shachi Kurl, former Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps, and radio host Jas Johal. The event is part of VIU's Engaged Citizen Speaker Series and is free for members of the public to attend. Michael MacKenzie paid a visit to the CHLY studio. Bad leaders, bad followers. What are the threats to democracy that we don't talk enough about?
Yeah, so thanks very much for having me. I think a lot of people are worried about leadership in our democratic systems today, and I think they should be. I think we don't have the kind of leaders that we imagine we want to have, and the leaders that we have are problematic in various ways. Not everybody, but there are a number of leaders that we are worried about. So I'm personally quite worried about Trump's anti-democratic rhetoric. I think he's quite anti-democratic. But we have to say more about what bad leadership consists of. We have to say more about what bad leaders are like in order to understand what good leadership is.
And so what is bad leadership like?
Well, there are a number of ways in which people can be bad leaders, and there are more ways in which people can be bad leaders than good leaders. So some of the literature on this identifies two dimensions of leadership. There are ethical or unethical leaders, and there are effective or ineffective leaders. But we have to think about both of those dimensions. So sometimes the leaders that we don't like are actually very effective, but unethical. And sometimes the leaders we like are ethical, but very ineffective. So you can be a bad leader by being unethical, cruel. You can be evil. You can be self-regarding at the expense of others. You can be corrupt. You can be unethical in a number of different ways, but very effective. And those are the bad leaders that I'm most worried about. But you can also be a bad leader by being very ethical, but ineffective. That is, unable to make changes in the world, because that's what leadership is about. It's about making changes in the world. It's about getting others to go along with you in making the world different in the future compared to how it is today. So there are lots of different ways of being a bad leader. And then you can be ineffective and unethical as well. I'm less concerned about those leaders. But there's only really one way of being a good leader. That's effective and ethical.
Now, you use the phrase leaders we like and leaders we don't like. Obviously, in a democracy, there are going to be leaders that some people like and some people do not like. How do you kind of make the distinction between I just don't like that person, they don't align with my political ideology, and this is a bad leader?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's precisely how we should be thinking about this, because I think that good leaders, and I can say more about this in a minute, good leaders enable us, empower us to negotiate diversity and disagreement. And so there will be people, leaders that we like or we don't like on because they align with our preferences or our objectives or our ideologies. And that is perfectly permissible. That's what we want in a democratic system. What we don't want are leaders who treat people like objects and obstacles. That's the primary way in which people can act unethically. So good leaders, good democratic leaders will have different opinions, and they will express contrary opinions. There'll be conflict, there'll be disagreement, all of that stuff. But it becomes objectively bad leadership, at least on democratic grounds, when leaders start treating other people like objects or obstacles. And that really is the difference here.
What's an example of a leader treating someone like an object or an obstacle?
Well, I think one of the most relevant examples right now is Vladimir Putin. I mean, when there is conflict, when there is disagreement in Russia, he jails, poisons, and kills people. That's treating people like objects.
Are we seeing any of the things you're talking about as regards bad leadership in Canada, or maybe even in BC or Nanaimo at the local level? How are these things manifesting themselves domestically?
Yeah, so I think there are different degrees of bad leadership, and I'm happy to say that I don't think we have a Putin in Canadian politics right now, at the national level, at the provincial level, or at the local level anywhere. So we don't have that degree of bad leadership, but I do think we should be thinking about this on a spectrum. And the features of bad leadership are the same all along the spectrum. So bad leaders offer us a false promise of escaping from the political condition. So you'll ask now, well, what's the political condition?
Exactly. You're doing my job for it.
The way I'm thinking about this is that politics happens when we have to live with others and people disagree. Okay? And this is part of the way we have to live together. When we live together, people will disagree, and we have to figure out ways of navigating that disagreement. And people disagree because they have different preferences, but people disagree because we have different material interests, and our material interests really matter. And we have often conflicting material interests, and that creates disagreement. People disagree because we have different identities and ways of thinking about the world. And this is part of the human condition. That means it's part of what being human means. And because of all the conflict and disagreement, it can be very uncomfortable. And I understand that. That's, people don't like having to deal with disagreement and conflict, but it also means that the political condition is one of complexity and uncertainty. And we have to learn to live with this. We have to learn to navigate it. And good political leaders, good democratic leaders, give us the tools to navigate complexity. They don't offer us simplicity in the face of complexity. Bad political leaders offer us a false promise of an escape from this political condition, an escape from diversity, conflict, disagreement, and complexity.
Is it easy in 2024 to explain and communicate that complexity to, say, voters?
Yeah, I mean, my view is that humans, us, we've never been comfortable with the political condition. It's always a little uncomfortable, and I understand why we want an escape from it. It's not easy to convey to people that there probably is no escape. The only escape from the political condition is to go live by yourself somewhere. And if that's not attractive, then you're not really escaping it. You're going to have to deal with it at some point. So conveying this is difficult. But the point really also is that good democratic leadership is difficult. So often bad leaders, and remember we're working on a spectrum, so we've got Putin over here killing people and poisoning his opponents, but it's a spectrum, and we have political leaders all over the place who are offering people simplicity in the face of complexity. They offer them slogans instead of having us confront real trade-offs that we're going to have to make. And when people have power, when leaders are acting, they will have to make trade-offs. And good democratic leaders will find ways of bringing their publics along in the difficult trade-offs that have to be made in order to make improvements in the world that benefit people.
Now, your talk is called Bad Leaders, Bad Followers. Can you tell me a little more about maybe that second piece and what you think someone needs to do to not be a bad follower?
Yeah, so I think what I mean by that is that, we talk about leadership in democratic and political systems all the time. In fact, our political systems are driven by leaders. Parties in Canada rise and fall on the strength and popularity of their leaders. And we acknowledge this, we recognize this, but we find it hard to say followers. We almost never hear this on the radio. We never see the word followers in the newspapers when we're talking about politics. I understand that because I think this is a democratic impulse. The idea of the follower is sort of the sycophant who does what's required, whatever the leader says, gives sort of unconditional loyalty to the follower. And that's not a democratic way of being. The democratic follower is critical, conditional, reflective, thinking about things. And so we find it hard to talk about followership in a democratic system. And I get that. And to make ourselves feel better, sometimes we call followers citizens, and that sort of conveys this critical aspect. I'm okay with that too. But we should acknowledge that we can't have leadership without followership. So it's worth thinking about what good and bad followership is. And I think to loop back to what I was saying previously about the political condition, bad followers are people who allow themselves to accept these false promises of escaping from the political condition.
I was speaking with someone once who worked in politics and got a tip from someone who was a kind of a member at the provincial level, I believe. And the tip was, in politics, if you're explaining, you're losing. Does that that sounds like the opposite of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you said that. That's exactly the problem. That really is the problem. If we need in a democratic system capacities in the leadership sphere, but also in the public sphere more generally, to confront complexity, have it explained to us, assess it, critically assess it, and accept or reject justifications that political leaders give us for the things that they do. That's the essence of democracy. You can't have legitimate democratic leaders without justification, without explanation, without them giving us an account of what they're doing. We can't even make good decisions about whether to elect somebody or elect somebody else if we don't have the reasons behind the things that the leaders are doing. So this idea that if you're explaining, you're losing is precisely what I'm talking about. That is bad leadership. Leaders need to figure out ways, and this is incumbent on them, figure out ways to convey complexity to help us make difficult trade-offs that society is going to have to make. That is what good democratic leadership requires.
Michael MacKenzie, thank you so much for coming on down to the studio.
Well, thanks very much for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Michael MacKenzie is the Jarislowsky Chair in Trust and Political Leadership at Vancouver Island University. You can catch his talk, Bad Leaders, Bad Followers, Monday at 6:30 at VIU's Malaspina Theatre. Admission is free. After the lecture, there will be a panel discussion and question and answer. MacKenzie will be joined by former Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps, radio host Jas Johal, and by Angus Reid Institute President Shachi Kurl, who we'll hear from coming up on the program.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Support Midcoast Morning and CHLY's nonprofit newsroom today by becoming a sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. Local news can't survive without your support. Another way to help us out is to share this show with your friends and tell them why they should support us. Finally, if you're listening to the podcast edition of Midcoast Morning, go and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast feed you use. It helps people find us.
Today on the show, we're talking threats to democracy. That's the subject of a free public lecture happening Monday night at VIU. Shachi Kurl will be in town to take part in a panel discussion following the keynote. She's president of the Angus Reid Institute, a Canadian public opinion research foundation. She also moderated the 2021 English Language Federal Leaders Debate. I got in touch with her ahead of her visit to Nanaimo.
I'm Shachi Kurl, and I'm the president of the Angus Reid Institute. I'm a former journalist and current pollster.
What are the polls maybe suggesting about threats to democracy and how people are perceiving them?
You know, Canadians, people in the States, people around the world, maybe some are thinking about threats to democracy, but most are really thinking about, particularly in a cost of living crisis, in a poison drug crisis, in an affordability crisis, in a climate crisis. They're thinking about things that are a little bit more in front of them. But it is the deterioration of trust in institutions. It's the deterioration of even the existence of local news organizations, local newsrooms, local media that have done a lot to create the conditions where in each of those crises, a lack of fair and a balanced and what I would call small d diverse range of thoughts, opinions on these issues, different takes, and people having different takes on how best to solve some of these issues has led to a place where more and more Canadians are feeling as though they don't necessarily have a place in public discourse. And so, you know, when you see, as we do in this country, that 2/3 say that there is no room for political compromise in the country today, when you see that a 60% feel like the country, that the federal government does not necessarily care about the issues that are important to them, where they are more inclined to say, as we saw them say in the last couple of years, that a significant number say you can't trust what news organizations report, and those numbers are increasing. It does give pause for things to go really squirrely, and we've seen examples of that. We've seen the way misinformation and disinformation proliferated on social media and in other forums can lead to just statements of fact, things that are objectively true, being up for argument or up for debate. And then what happens is you will have, you know, different folks along the small and the big P political spectrum starting to throw mud at each other. And in some cases, well, obviously you have to push back when people deny facts. But in many cases, that condemnation can go even further. And what it does is it has the impact of either otherizing some Canadians so that they completely check out of public discourse and public conversation and feeling like they have a right to say anything. But more than that, it's rendered a lot of Canadians basically a little bit verklempt or silent or mute because they feel like they can't speak up for fear of saying the wrong thing. And we see that particularly when it comes to some of the studies we've done around the culture wars, where the data shows us that maybe only 40% of the population is having a voice and having a say in issues that affect 100% of the country. And what I mean by that is you've got people on one end of the political spectrum who are very resistant to any kind of change, whether that's societal change, economic change, cultural change around racism or equity or equality or any number of issues. And then you've got the people who are totally proponents of changing everything all the time. And they believe very passionately in what they believe in. And the resistors believe very passionately in what they believe in. And in the middle, you've got about 60% of Canadians who are on neither side of that debate. But they're leaning somewhere in the middle of it. Maybe they have a point of view about some things, but not everything. maybe in some cases they feel like they need or want more information, but they find themselves in a place where they are exhausted by sort of the ongoing punch and counterpunch of the culture wars, which are being exacerbated by our politicians, that are being exacerbated in many cases, maybe on purpose, maybe not, by what remains of media organizations that are increasingly offering a more narrowed view of the world, of Canada, of communities. And a lot of people, again, just sort of find themselves feeling like they're on the outside.
So if that is what the data is suggesting is kind of the where we are now, what do you think is maybe the path forward to navigate some of those challenges in maybe a healthy way as a society?
Well, I think even measuring where Canadians are on a lot of these issues and the level of exhaustion they feel about, things like cancel culture or the culture wars, or just the notion that you can't even ask a question from a purely information gathering point of view, or it's not possible to say, well, on one hand, I agree with X, but on the other hand, I have questions about why. We're increasingly in a media and a political narrative where you're either all in on one side of something or all in on the other side, and we're losing nuance. We're losing the ability to in a way that is public or societal, hold two conflicting thoughts in your head at the same time. This seems to cause a lot of folks' brains to break. So I do think that just, stepping back a little bit and trying to, instead of talk past each other, which is what our politicians and our leaders are doing a very effective job at doing when it comes to one another. But more than that, they're only speaking to their own bases. They're only speaking to the people who support them. They rarely comes the time when they are speaking to people who may not support them or agree with them and say, hey, and we see you, and we know we don't agree. You don't agree with us, or we don't agree with you. But it doesn't necessarily make you bad people. You just have a very different view of the world. And again, when it comes to issues that are subjective, I'm not talking about facts. Like, facts are facts. But when you're dealing with subjective issues or pretty thorny and complex policy questions, I think we're into a place where we would all of us would do a little bit better to listen more, maybe talk a little bit less, and create space for people who are trying to sort through what they think in real time. And the current political and public and media narrative doesn't really offer a lot of room for that anymore.
That's interesting. I was speaking with Michael MacKenzie earlier today, who's giving this lecture, and he said a big part of what he views as bad leadership is offering simplicity in the face of complexity, which it sounds like is something you just described there. I'm wondering maybe what's the role for public opinion polling to play in mitigating that if it's an issue?
Again, it's the importance of measurement, and it's the importance of having an accurate picture of where Canadians are, not where the politicians say they are, not where media say they are, not where journalists say they are, not where the chattering classes or pundits say they are, but actually where Canadians are themselves, and then holding that mirror back up to society. And in many cases, and I know because I get very, very cranky, nasty emails sometimes, but I know the extent to which people are sometimes very jarred because opinion of the day does not match their worldview. And I think it's healthy for people to know that, there is a perspective that is either a source of consensus, mostly people agree, or that things are very divisive, so that you've got a starting point. You've got a language and a framework to start having those conversations.
And before I let you go, why do you think someone who's sitting here in Nanaimo should come out and take in the lecture, take in this panel discussion that you're going to be a part of? Why is it important to go out and be there Monday night in person?
Well, I spent many years living on Vancouver Island. I covered Nanaimo during my career as a journalist, and I know the people of Nanaimo are a curious and spirited group, and there's a tremendous amount of pride in community in Nanaimo. And so, come out, because it's going to be an important conversation about how neighbors are able to talk to neighbors at a time when increasingly they feel like they can't do that anymore.
Shachi Kurl, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thanks for having me.
Shachi Kurl is president of the Angus Reid Institute, a Canadian public opinion research foundation. She'll be part of a panel discussion on threats to democracy Monday night at VIU's Malaspina Theatre. The panel also features former Victoria Mayor Lisa Helps and radio host and former MLA Jas Johal. It follows a lecture from VIU's Michael MacKenzie. The event is free to attend and gets underway at 6:30. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Frew is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe for updates from our nonprofit newsroom and more. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Snuneymuxw First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.